In the small, quiet town of Willow Creek, Edward Miller sat on the worn armchair of his modest home, staring blankly at the clock on the wall. It had been over 2 months since his son James had visited. Edward, a retired school teacher, had spent most of his life nurturing James, raising him alone after his wife passed away when James was just a child. He had poured all his love, energy, and savings into ensuring James had a bright future. James did make something of himself, a high-powered executive in the bustling city of Chicago. But with success came distance. Visits became rare, and calls were short, perfunctory exchanges. Edward consoled himself by believing James was simply busy building his career, but deep down, he longed for the warmth and companionship of his only family. Then came the breaking point. On a crisp autumn morning, James visited unexpectedly. Edward's heart leaped with joy, but the excitement was short-lived. James, looking hurried and uncomfortable, handed Edward a document. "Dad, I've arranged everything for you to move into a retirement community. It's a nice place with all the care you need. You'll love it there," he said, his tone more dismissive than reassuring. Edward froze, the words hitting him like a hammer. "James, I don't need a retirement community. I need my son," he replied, his voice trembling. But James, avoiding eye contact, said, "I don't have the time, Dad." "You'll be happier there. Trust me." Before Edward could protest further, James left, leaving behind a stunned and heartbroken father. Edward's world crumbled. The house, once filled with laughter and memories, now felt like a cold, hollow shell. For days, he sat in silence, his heart aching from the betrayal of the one person he had devoted his entire life to. Yet, amidst the suffocating pain, something stirred within Edward. He looked at the photo of young James on the mantel, a boy who once held his hand and trusted him for everything. "If my own son can abandon me, I must learn to stand alone," Edward whispered to himself. "But I will not let him forget what he's done." Hook. That night, Edward opened a dusty journal he hadn't touched in years. "This is where it begins," he said, determination glinting in his tear-filled eyes. The days following James's abandonment were suffocating for Edward. The house, once a haven of cherished memories, now felt like a prison of solitude. But Edward wasn't ready to surrender to despair. Sitting at his worn desk one morning, he flipped open the journal, where he had jotted down old dreams and ideas from his youth. His gaze fell on a sketch he had drawn decades ago, a small idea for a home library and tutoring center. "This dream doesn't have to die with my old age," Edward murmured, a spark of hope flickering in his chest. With the little savings he had left and a modest pension, Edward began his mission. He cleared out his garage, scrubbed the floors, and built shelves from reclaimed wood. He placed an ad in the local paper and on community boards, offering free tutoring for struggling students. Slowly but surely, children from the neighborhood began to trickle in, their curious faces lighting up at the sight of books and Edward's warm demeanor. At first, it was just a few kids needing help with math or science. But soon, word spread about the garage genius, and more families reached out. Edward found purpose in teaching again, his days filled with laughter and learning. The garage, once a dusty and forgotten space, transformed into a lively hub of education and inspiration. As the months passed, Edward's small project gained momentum. Local businesses donated supplies, and volunteers offered their time. Edward started hosting workshops, reading sessions, and even small community events. His humble garage became a beacon of hope, a place where children found guidance and struggling parents found solace. But Edward's transformation didn't end with the library. He began documenting every step of his journey, his struggles, triumphs, and the moments of joy he found in helping others. Late at night, he wrote in his journal, "When life takes everything from you, it also gives you the freedom to rebuild from scratch. And when you rebuild, make it so remarkable that those who abandoned you cannot ignore it." The once lonely Edward was now surrounded by love and respect, not from his son, but from a community that saw his worth. People started referring to him as Mr. Miller, the heart of Willow Creek. One evening, after a long day of tutoring, Edward received a letter. It was from a journalist who had heard about the garage genius and wanted to feature his story. Edward smiled, knowing this was just the beginning of something bigger. Edward's story spread like wildfire. The article about the garage genius was published in a prominent newspaper, and soon people from neighboring towns started visiting Willow Creek to meet the man who had turned heartbreak into hope. Donations poured in, allowing Edward to expand his tutoring center. The once cramped garage was now a full-fledged community library and learning hub. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of Chicago, James stumbled across the article while scrolling through his phone during a business meeting. The headline caught his eye. "The Garage Genius: How One Man Built a Community from Scratch." He froze, staring at the picture of his father, smiling warmly as he taught a group of children. James felt an unsettling mix of pride and shame. He had abandoned Edward, believing his father would fade into quiet obscurity. Instead, Edward had become a beacon of inspiration. Unable to shake the gnawing guilt, James decided to visit Willow Creek under the guise of reconnecting. He drove into town, his luxury car looking out of place among the humble streets. As he approached the learning center, he was greeted by the laughter of children and the sight of Edward helping a young boy with his homework. "Dad," James called out hesitantly, his voice cracking. Edward looked up, his expression calm but distant. "James," he replied simply, before turning back to the boy and finishing the lesson. James waited until Edward was free, then said, I'm proud of what you've done here, Dad. It's incredible." Edward nodded, his face unreadable. "I had to build something out of the pieces you left behind," he said, his voice steady but cutting. "Why are you here, James?" James swallowed hard. "I came to see you, to apologize. I didn't realize how much I hurt you until I read about everything you've achieved." Edward's gaze pierced through him. "You didn't come because you missed me. You came because my success made you uncomfortable. It's not guilt you feel, James. It's regret that the world sees me thriving without you." James flinched, but he couldn't deny the truth in his father's words. As they stood in silence, Edward handed him a neatly bound journal. "What's this?" James asked. "My journey," Edward replied. "Read it. Understand the pain you caused, not to punish yourself, but to learn what it means to value someone before they're gone." Hook. That night, James sat in his expensive apartment, reading the journal. Each page unraveled the depths of Edward's heartbreak and the strength it took to rebuild his life. As he read the final entry, a single sentence stood out. "Forgiveness is earned, not demanded, and sometimes it is never given." Days turned into weeks, But James couldn't shake the weight of Edward's journal. Each word echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the father he had abandoned. The final sentence, "Forgiveness is earned, not demanded, and sometimes it is never given," stung the most. James knew he had to face the consequences of his actions, but he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to make things right. One sunny afternoon, James returned to Willow Creek, determined to speak with his father again. The Learning Center was busier than ever, with parents, children, and volunteers bustling about. James spotted Edward sitting under a large oak tree, reading to a group of children. The sight was heartwarming, but it also drove a dagger of guilt deeper into James's heart. When Edward finished, James approached hesitantly. "Dad," he began, his voice trembling, "I've read your journal, every word. I know I can't undo the pain I caused, but I'm here to make amends." Edward looked at him, his eyes calm but unyielding. "James, I didn't write that journal for you to make amends. I wrote it so you would understand the consequences of your choices." James knelt before his father, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dad. I just want a chance to be part of your life again, to prove that I can change." Edward sighed deeply, a mix of sadness and wisdom in his expression. "James, I've rebuilt my life without you. The people here, they stood by me when you didn't. They became my family when my own son turned away. I can't pretend that everything is fine just because you've had a change of heart." James lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I'll keep trying, no matter how long it takes." Edward placed a hand on James's shoulder. "That's a start. But understand this. Forgiveness doesn't erase the scars. You'll need to earn not just my trust, but also your own redemption." The two sat in silence for a long while, the sounds of the bustling center filling the space between them. Edward stood up and returned to his work, leaving James to reflect on the road ahead. Months later, James became a regular visitor to the Learning Center, volunteering his time and resources. He worked tirelessly, helping children and supporting the community. Though Edward remained guarded, he couldn't deny the genuine effort James was making. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Edward handed James a new journal. "This one's for you," he said. "Write your own story now. Make it one worth remembering." James held the journal tightly, understanding the gravity of the gift. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude and determination. Final twist and call to action. As Edward watched James walk away, he smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Sometimes change doesn't come from forgiveness. It comes from the weight of guilt." For more emotional stories filled with resilience and powerful twists, like, share, and subscribe our channel Stories of Brilliance.